Good evening, and thank you for joining us. For tonight's story, we are reading from Hans Christian Andersen. This story is a classic. It is called The Sandman. In all the world, there is no one who knows so many stories as the Sandman, and he knows how to tell them too. When it is evening and children are sitting around a table or in a corner on a stool, then he comes sneaking up the stairs. He walks on his stocking feet and makes no noise. Quietly, he opens the door and slips into the room and throws a little sand into the eyes of the children. Then they find it difficult to keep them open. He stands behind them and blows softly down their necks, and their heads seem, oh, so heavy. But it doesn't hurt, for the Sandman loves children. He just wants them to get into bed and lie there quietly so that he can tell them stories. When the children have fallen asleep, the Sandman sits on their beds. He wears very strange clothes. His suit is made out of silk, but it is quite impossible to tell what color it is, for it changes all the time. One moment it is green, the next it's red, and then it may turn blue. Under each arm he has an umbrella. One of them is all covered with pictures, and that he puts on the headboards of the beds of good children, so that they will dream wonderful stories all the night through. The other umbrella has no pictures at all. That is the one bad children get. They toss and turn all night, and when they wake in the morning, they haven't dreamed anything at all. Now I want to tell you the stories that the Sandman told a little boy named Halmar during 1 week. There are 7 stories, for there are 7 days in a week. Monday. Now look, said the Sandman that evening after he had gotten into bed. I think I'll fix up your room a little. At once, all the potted plants grew into huge trees that reached all the way to the ceiling. They stretched their limbs across it, and up and down the walls. The room became the loveliest green arbor. On all the branches flowers bloomed. Every one of them was more beautiful and fragrant than a rose, and if you ate them, they tasted sweeter than jam. There were fruits on the trees that shone like gold, and buns bursting with raisins. Oh, it was quite marvelous. But amidst all this splendor, someone was unhappy. The sound of sighing and whimpering came from the table drawer where Halmar kept his school books. Now what is the matter? Said the Sandman as he opened the drawer. It was the slate that was sighing. Hjalmar had done his sums on it and added everything up wrong. The slate pencil, which hung from a piece of string on the corner of the slate, was jumping about in agony, as a little dog does on a leash. It wanted to help, but it couldn't. Halmar's exercise book was sobbing too. It was heartrending to hear. On the top of each page were printed the most exquisite letters, models for the student to copy. Hjalmar had tried, but his letters did not resemble the printed ones. They didn't stand up straight, but more or less dragged themselves along the lines. They looked as if they were fainting or having fits. Stand up straight, screamed the printed letters. Look at us. Oh, we would love to, sighed Hjalmar's letters, but we can't. We are not feeling well. You should have cod liver oil, said the Sandman. That helped. The letters that Hjalmar had written got so frightened that they immediately straightened themselves. I see there won't be any time for stories tonight. I'd better drill them, said the Sandman as he looked severely at the poor letters. They in turn blushed, and all the A's appeared really ashamed. Left, right, he commanded, and the letters obeyed him as if they were soldiers. Soon they stood as straight and handsome as their printed brothers. But the next morning, when Hjalmar peeped at them, they looked just as wretched as they had the day before. Tuesday. As soon as Hjalmar had gotten to bed, the Sandman touched all the furniture in the room with his magic wand, and they began to talk. They all talked about themselves, except for the spittoon. It stood silently in its corner. It was so disgusted by the vanity and egocentricity of all the others, who only thought about themselves and never, not even for a moment, of poor creatures like himself who had to stand in the corner and be spit at. On the wall above the chest of drawers hung a painting of the landscape, with trees, flowers, and a meadow. In the background there were several castles. It was a very pretty painting, framed in gold. The Sandman touched the painting, and everything within it became alive. The birds began to sing, and the branches of the trees swayed in the wind. The clouds sailed in the sky, casting their shadows upon the grass in the meadow. The Sandman lifted the sleeping Hjalmar out of his bed and held him up to the picture. The boy took a step, and there he was, inside the painting. The sun was shining through the leaves of the trees. He ran down to the river. There was a little sailing ship moored to the bank. It was painted red and white. The sails shone like silver, and 6 swans with golden crowns on their heads drew it through the water. Halimar sailed past the forest, and the trees told him stories about robbers, witches, the little elves that lived in flowers, and the tales that they, the trees, had heard from the butterflies. The most wonderful fish, with silver and gold scales, swam around the boat. They jumped out of the water and into the air, and then fell with a splash back down into the river. Birds of all colors and sizes flew above him. All the animals, even the mosquitoes and flying beetles, wanted to get near Hjalmar, and each one had a little story to tell him. It was a real voyage. At one moment, Hjalmar was sailing through a dense, dark forest, and the next, through a beautiful garden filled with sunlight and flowers. He sailed past marble castles, and on their balconies stood the loveliest princesses. And the strangest part of it was that they looked exactly like the girls he played with every day. The princesses were holding sugar pigs that were better than the ones you could buy in the marketplace. The girls offered to share them with Hjalmar when he took hold of an end of a pig. It broke off, and he always received the larger piece, and the princess the smaller one. In front of every castle, a little prince with a golden sword stood guard, and when Hjalmar sailed by, they ordered it to rain tin soldiers and raisins, for they were real princes. Sometimes he seemed to be sailing through the halls of a great mansion, and on other times, right through fantastic towns. He visited the one where the nursemaid lives, who had taken care of him when he was a baby. Hjalmar loved her dearly. There she stood on the square, waving to him and singing a little verse about him, which she had composed herself. Oh, my little boy, how I do miss the sight of your sweet face, the little mouth that I did kiss, your trusting innocent gaze. I shared your laughter, your mirth, and yet we had to part. May God bless you on this earth and keep pure your loving heart. And all the birds joined her song. The flowers danced and the trees nodded as if they, too, had been told stories by the Sandman. Wednesday. It was pouring outside. Hjalmar could hear the rain beating on the roof, even though he was sleeping. The Sandman opened the window. The street had become a lake, and right below Hjalmar's window a great ship was moored. Come for a sail, Hjalmar, said the Sandman. This ship will take you far away, and yet when you wake up tomorrow, you will be back in your bed. Hjalmar stood up and got dressed in his Sunday suit. Once he was on the deck of the ship, it was no longer raining. The sun was shining. A wind gently filled the sails. The ship tacked around the church and through the streets. Soon it was out on the ocean. As far as the eye could see stretched the wild sea. Hjalmar saw a flock of storks. They were on their way to the hot countries. One of the storks flew low and far behind the others. They had been flying for days, and this stork was ever so tired. Its great wings beat slower and slower as it came nearer and nearer to the surface of the sea. It tried to gain height, but it couldn't. Then it collided with the sail of the ship, falling with a loud bump down on the deck. The cabin boy picked it up and put it in the little hen coop amid the ship. There it stood, looking very bedraggled and sad among the hens and ducks and turkeys. "What a creature!" cackled all the hens. The turkey cock rustled his feathers and made himself look twice as big as he was. Then he spoke to the stork, asking him who he was and where he had come from. The ducks nudged each other and said, "Quack, quack." The stork told them about the hot countries, about Egypt with its pyramids, and the ostrich that can run across the desert sands faster than a horse. The ducks didn't understand a word he said, and therefore remarked to each other, "Let us agree that he is stupid." "Certainly he is stupid," gobbled the turkey cock, making so much noise that the stork stopped talking. He just stood in a corner of the coop and thought about Africa. "What beautiful, long, thin legs," gobbled the turkey. "What do they cost a yard?" "Quack, quack, quack," laughed all the ducks, while the stork pretended that he hadn't heard the insult. "You ought to join in the merriment," said the turkey, for it was very witty indeed. "Or do you find it too low a joke? I mean, for someone like you who has such high legs." "Gobble, gobble," laughed the turkey. "You have no sense of humor. The rest of us have both wit and intellect. We are most interesting." The turkey gobbled and the ducks quacked, for they found themselves ever so amusing. Halmar walked over to the hen coop, opened the door, and let the stork out. Now that it was rested, the stork could fly again. It nodded to Halmar as though it were saying, "Thank you," and then it spread its great wings and flew south to Egypt. The hens clucked, the ducks quacked, and the turkey cock got all red in the face. "Tomorrow we are going to cook soup of you," said Halmar. And then he woke up. He was back in his little bed. That certainly had been a strange journey the Sandman had taken him out on. Thursday. "Now," began the Sandman, "don't be afraid. Here is a little mouse." And he held the little sweet furry animal up to Halmar. "It has come to invite you to a wedding. Two of the little mice who live beneath the floor of your mother's larder have decided to marry. They have a beautiful apartment down there." "But how will I get down through the mouse hole?" asked Hjalmar. "Let me see," said the Sandman thoughtfully. "I will have to make you smaller." He touched Hjalmar with his magic wand. Instantly the boy began to grow smaller, until finally he wasn't larger than your forefinger. "Now you can borrow the tin soldier's uniform. It is always nice to wear a uniform when you are invited out." "I will," said Hjalmar, and in a moment he had the uniform on and looked like the nicest little tin soldier. "Please, sir, would you be so kind as to sit down in your mother's thimble? That will be your carriage, and I will be your horse," said the little female mouse. "Am I to be pulled by a girl? Won't it be too hard work?" asked Hjalmar politely, but he was already on his way to the mouse wedding. They were driving in a long corridor that was just wide enough for the mouse and her guest to pass through. It wasn't dark at all. Little pieces of dry, rotten wood illuminated the way. "Doesn't it smell lovely here?" asked the mouse. "The hull has been greased with lard, and that of the best quality." Now they entered the chamber where the wedding was to take place. To the right stood all the female mice. They were whispering to each other and making faces. To the left stood the male mice. They were stroking their whiskers, but didn't say much. In the middle of the room were the bridal couple. They sat on a cheese rind and kissed each other all the time, which was permissible in public, for they were engaged and soon would be married. More and more guests arrived. The room was soon so crowded that the smaller mice had to stand in the corners, or they would have been trampled to death. It didn't help that the bridal couple were now standing in the doorway and nearly blocking it. The room had been greased with lard, just like the corridor. That was the wedding feast, which the guests could munch on whichever they wished. As dessert, a pea was served. In it, a member of the family had bitten the bridal couple's initials. It was most extraordinary. All the mice declared that it had been a marvelous wedding, and the conversation had been extremely intelligent. All the mice declared that it had been a oh. When it was over, the little female mouse drove Hjalmar back. It had certainly been a distinguished feast. He had been invited to attend, but he had had to make himself small and put on a tin soldier's uniform. Friday. There are so many grown-ups who plague me to come and visit them, said the Sandman, especially those who have a bad conscience. Oh, kind Sandman, they beg, please come. We can't sleep. Our eyes won't close. We have to lie awake all night and look at our bad deeds. They sit like little trolls at the end of our beds and throw boiling water on us to keep us awake. Won't you come and tell them to go away so that we can sleep? And then they sigh so deeply and say, we will pay you for it. Just come and say good night to us, sweet Sandman. We have put the money on the windowsill, but that kind of favor you can't buy for money, explained the Sandman. What is going to happen tonight? Asked Hjalmar. Would you like to go to another wedding? Laughed the Sandman. It will be a little different from the one you went to last night. Your sister's doll, the one that is dressed as a man and whom you all call Herman, wants to marry the doll named Bertha. It is Bertha's birthday today, and she's expecting a lot of presents. Oh, I know all about that, Hjalmar sounded bored. My sister is always making birthday parties or holding weddings for her dolls, especially when they need new clothes. I think she has done it 100 times. But tonight is the 101st time, and that is an anniversary that doesn't take place often. When that is over, everything is over. Come take a look. Hjalmar glanced toward the table where his playthings were. There was a light in the window of the little paper dollhouse, and outside it stood all his tin soldiers and presented arms. The bridal couple sat on the floor. They were leaning their backs against the leg of the table and looking pensively at each other. And that was not so strange. After all, they were getting married. The Sandman had put on Hjalmar's grandmother's skirt and was busy performing the marriage ceremony. As soon as it was over, all the furniture sang this beautiful song, which the pencil had written especially for the occasion. He didn't care whether the words made sense, as long as they rhymed. Wedding 101 has only just begun. He is proud as a pin, she is made of skin. Hurrah for pin, hurrah for skin, whose married life does now begin. When it was time to give presents, Then it was time to give presents, but the two dolls had declared they didn't want anything eatable. They were going to live on love. Should we go to the country or travel abroad for our honeymoon? Asked the groom. This was a weighty problem, and therefore both the swallow and who had traveled widely and the old hen from the farmyard who had hatched 5 broods of chickens were asked to give their opinions. The swallow told all about the countries of the south, where grapes hung in clusters on the vines, and the air was mild and warm. He described the mountains and their strange and beautiful colors, so different from those one can see in the north. Ah, but they don't have any kale, clucked the hen. I spent one summer out in the country. I had my little chickens with me. We vacationed in a gravel pit. Sand is so delightful to scratch and scrape in. And we were allowed to visit the part of the garden where the kale grew. It had a lovely green color. I am sure that nothing has a more beautiful color. But one kale plant looks just like all the others, said the swallow. And besides, the weather is always so bad here. We are used to that, replied the hen. But it is always cold. I am freezing, shivered the swallow. That is good for the kale, cackled the hen. Besides, sometimes the weather is hot here too. I remember a summer 4 years ago. It lasted almost 5 weeks. It was so hot you could hardly breathe. Besides, in foreign lands, they have all sorts of creepy, poisonous things and bandits. I think that people who don't love their native land are ungrateful scoundrels who shouldn't be allowed to live here. And the hen began to cry, though she continued to talk. I have traveled myself once, 12 miles in a wooden crate. Believe me, traveling is no pleasure. I think the hen is a very sensible woman, said the doll, called Bertha. I don't like to travel in mountains myself. What is it, but up one side and down the other? No. Let us move out to the gravel pit and go for walks among the kale stalks. And that is what they decided to do. Saturday. Are you going to tell me a story? Asked Hjalmar as soon as he had gotten into bed. No, tonight I haven't got time for one, said the Sandman, and opened his most beautiful umbrella over Hjalmar's bed. But you can look at this. It is all Chinese. Suddenly the umbrella looked like a Chinese bowl. Inside it there was a whole world. Blue trees and blue bridges with little Chinese men and women standing on them and nodding their heads at Hjalmar. Today I have to see to it that the whole world is properly cleaned, for tomorrow is Sunday, you know. I have to go to the church towers to find out whether the church elves have remembered to polish the bells so they won't sound false. Then I have to go out into the fields and inspect them to make sure that the wind has dusted all the flowers and trees. But the most important work is to take down all the stars and polish them. I put them in my apron, but first I have to number all the holes so that I can put them back in the right place again. If I don't, some of them might not fit correctly. Then they might slip out, and there will be too many shooting stars falling down, one after the other. Now look here, Mr. Sandman, said the old portrait of Halmar's great grandfather, which hung on the wall opposite Halmar's bed. I am the boy's great grandfather, and I am pleased that you tell Halmar stories, but you must not confuse the child. One cannot take down stars and polish them. The stars are planets like our Earth, and that is exactly what is so exciting about them. Thank you, old great grandfather, said the Sandman, but he didn't look the least bit grateful. You are the head of the family, the great head, the great head. But I am a great deal older than you are. I am a heathen. The Romans and the Greeks worshipped me and called me the god of dreams. I have visited the grandest palaces and am still a welcome guest anywhere. I know how to please both children and grown-ups. But why don't you tell a story? With these words, the Sandman left, taking his umbrella with him. These days, one is not even allowed to express an opinion, grumbled great grandfather's portrait. And then Hjalmar woke up. Sunday. Good evening, said the Sandman. Hjalmar nodded his head as a greeting, then jumped out of bed, ran over to great grandfather's portrait, and turned his face to the wall so he couldn't interrupt as he had done yesterday. Now tell me the story about the 5 peas in the pod, the tale of the cock that crowed too loud, and the one about the darning needle that was so proud that she thought she was a sewing needle, demanded Hjalmar. That was a lot, said the Sandman. You know, you can get too much of a good thing. Besides, I like to show you things rather than tell you stories. I think I will let you see my brother. He is also called the Sandman, but he only visits you once, and then he carries you away on his horse. He tells you a story, but he only knows two. One is the loveliest story ever told, so beautiful that you cannot imagine it. The other is so ugly and terrifying that it, too, is indescribable. The Sandman lifted little Halmar up so that he could see out the window. There rides my brother, the other Sandman, who is called Death. He is not really as frightening or as horrible as he is portrayed in books. He is not a skeleton. That is just the silver embroidery on his uniform. Being in the cavalry, he rides a horse, looking at his lovely velvet cape fluttering in the wind behind him as he gallops by. And Halmar saw how Death rode and dismounted to take away the people who had died. Some were old, but others were young. Some he placed in front of him and others behind him. He asked everyone the same question. How is your report card? And all of them replied, Oh, it is fine. But he was not satisfied with their answers. He had to look himself. Everyone who had good remarks he put in front of him, and to them he told the loveliest story in the world. But those who had bad marks he put behind him, and they were told a terrible story. They cried and wanted to jump down from the horse, but they couldn't. I think Death is a nice Sandman, said Halmar. I am not afraid of him. Oh, there is no reason to be, smiled the Sandman. Just make certain that you have a good report card. Now that is what I call a very instructive story, mumbled great-grandfather's picture. You see, it helps to complain and express one's opinion. Now he was satisfied. Now you have heard the story of the Sandman. You can ask him to tell you stories himself when he comes tonight. Thank you so much for listening. That was The Sandman by Hans Christian Andersen. Good night, everybody.